Picture this. Four brothers from a sharecropper family in rural Lee County, Mississippi, dirt poor, barely educated, no connections, roll into Detroit in the early 1980s with nothing but ambition and a pickup truck. Within 5 years, they are moving $3 million a day in crack cocaine. They employ over 500 people. They control entire zip codes. They have their own security force, their own internal justice system, and their own set of laws. And then, just as fast as they rose, the whole thing came crashing down in one of the most dramatic federal takedowns in Michigan history. This is the story of Billy, Larry, Willie, and Otis Chambers, the Detroit kingpins who built a crack empire so massive, so organized, so ruthlessly efficient that even federal investigators admitted they had never seen anything like it. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. To understand the Chambers brothers, you have to understand where they started. Because the distance between Lee County, Mississippi, and the top of Detroit's drug trade is not just geographical, it's generational. Lee County in the 1960s and 70s was still very much operating on the bones of the Old South. Black families like the Chambers worked as sharecroppers, a system that, let's be honest, was slavery with a different name tag. You worked land you didn't own, gave a cut of what you grew to a landlord, and stayed perpetually in debt to a system designed to keep you exactly where you were. Poor, dependent, going nowhere. The Chambers' parents raised their boys in that world. No running water in the early years, scant formal education. The kind of poverty that doesn't just affect your bank account, it shapes how you see the world, what you believe is possible, and how far you're willing to go to escape it. But here's the thing about people who grow up with nothing. Some of them develop an almost supernatural hunger, a drive that comfortable people never quite find. The Chambers brothers had that hunger in spades. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, like thousands of other Black Southern families before them, the brothers began making their way north. The Great Migration had been pulling Black Americans towards cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland for decades, chasing factory jobs, better wages, a chance at something different. Detroit, at that moment, was a city in free fall. To understand the Chambers brothers' rise, you have to understand what Detroit looked like in 1983. The city had been hemorrhaging manufacturing jobs since the 1970s. The auto industry, the backbone of Detroit's entire economy, the reason the city existed, was being gutted by automation, foreign competition, and corporate relocation. Between 1978 and 1982, Detroit lost over 200,000 jobs. Not restructured, not relocated within the city, gone. What that meant on the ground was devastating. Entire neighborhoods that had once housed working-class Black families with union wages and benefits, solid, stable communities, collapsed almost overnight. Unemployment in some Black Detroit neighborhoods hit 30, 40, even 50%. Young men with no high school diploma and no factory floor to walk into had few visible paths forward. The city's tax base evaporated along with those jobs. Schools deteriorated. City services crumbled. Whole blocks of houses were abandoned. Detroit, which had once been one of America's most prosperous industrial cities, was becoming a landscape of ruins. And into that vacuum, that economic, social, and psychological vacuum, came crack cocaine. Crack hit American cities like a biological weapon in the early 1980s. It was cheap, it was fast, it was extraordinarily addictive, and it created an instant, massive market in exactly the communities that had been stripped of everything else. Historians and sociologists have written entire books about whether this was coincidence or something more sinister. The CIA's alleged ties to crack distribution networks were investigated by Congress, but regardless of origin, the effect on cities like Detroit was catastrophic. Someone was going to get rich off that catastrophe. The Chambers brothers decided it would be them. Billy Chambers was the first to arrive in Detroit around 1983. He was young, sharp, and immediately clocked what was happening in the city's drug markets. Crack was new. The infrastructure to distribute it at scale didn't yet exist. It was, in the coldest business terms imaginable, a market opportunity. It was, in the coldest business terms imaginable, a market opportunity. He sent word back south. His brothers came, and then they started recruiting, not just family, but an entire pipeline of young people from Lee County and surrounding areas, bringing them north with promises of money, housing, and opportunity. What the Chambers brothers built was not a street gang. Let's be clear about that distinction. It was a corporation, an actual structured hierarchical business operation that would have been recognizable to any MBA student, just with a very different product line and a very different enforcement division. At its peak, their operation controlled a network of crack houses across Detroit's east side. Estimates vary, but investigators believed they were running somewhere between 100 and 225 crack houses at peak operation. They had a supply chain, a distribution network, quality control, and HR of a kind. The operation worked like this. The brothers sat at the top. Below them were managers who oversaw clusters of crack houses. Below those were the workers, lookouts, runners, house managers, and sellers, many of whom were teenagers or young adults from the same desperate southern counties the brothers had escaped. They were essentially recruiting the most vulnerable young black men they could find, dangling cash in front of people who had never had any. At the absolute height of their operation, investigators estimated they were generating somewhere in the range of $1 to $3 million per day. Read that number again. Per day. They were so flush that workers reportedly got paid in $1,000 bundles, and managers could clear tens of thousands of dollars a week. In a city where entire neighborhoods were living on nothing, that kind of money was almost incomprehensible. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Because the Chambers brothers weren't operating in some abstract economic universe. They were operating in real neighborhoods, around real people, in a real city. And the destruction they left behind was staggering. The crack houses weren't just business locations. They became epicenters of addiction, violence, and community collapse. Families were torn apart. Children grew up in houses where their parents had become shells of themselves chasing a high. The neighborhoods where the Chambers operation was heaviest became some of the most dangerous and desperate in the entire country. The violence was relentless. Rival operators were dealt with brutally. People who stole from the organization, who cooperated with police, who stepped out of line. The enforcement was swift and often deadly. Detroit's homicide rate during the mid to late 1980s was among the worst in the nation. The Chambers operation wasn't the only cause, but it was a significant one. And yet, and this is the part that requires honest reckoning, many of the people who worked for the Chambers brothers did so because there was genuinely nothing else. The factories were gone. The schools were failing. The city had essentially abandoned these communities. When a 17-year-old from Lee County, Mississippi arrives in Detroit with no diploma and no skills and is offered $1,000 a week to stand on a corner, that's not just a moral failure on his part. That's a systemic failure on a massive scale. The Chambers brothers didn't create the conditions that made their empire possible. America did that. They just exploited it, ruthlessly, efficiently, and without apparent remorse. By 1987 and 1988, law enforcement had the Chambers operation squarely in its sights. And this was no ordinary investigation. The DEA, the FBI, and the Detroit Police Department coordinated a massive multi-agency effort specifically targeting the brothers. The scale of what they were dealing with forced a level of federal involvement that was unusual for the era. This wasn't a local bust. This was an organized crime takedown. What made the investigation particularly dramatic was just how visible the operation had become. The Chambers brothers weren't hiding. Their crack houses operated essentially openly. Their workers were on corners in broad daylight. There were too many houses, too many employees, and too much money flowing for anyone to pretend it wasn't happening. Investigators used informants, some willing, some flipped under pressure, to map the organization from the inside. They documented the hierarchy, the money flows, the supply chains. Federal wiretaps captured conversations that laid bare just how structured and deliberate the operation was. In 1988, the hammer came down. Federal indictment swept up the Chambers brothers and dozens of their associates in a coordinated series of arrests. It was one of the largest drug busts in Michigan history up to that point. The sheer scale of the indictment, the number of defendants, the breadth of the charges, the dollar amounts involved, made national news. But here's one of the wildest details in this whole saga. When agents moved in, they discovered cash. Not just money, stacks and stacks of cash that the organization literally could not spend fast enough. In one famous account from the investigation, law enforcement found bags of rotting money, bills that had deteriorated because they'd been stored improperly, and there was simply too much of it to manage. They were making money faster than they could launder it. That image, cash literally rotting because there was too much of it, became one of the defining symbols of just how massive this operation had become. The federal trial of the Chambers brothers was a spectacle. Given the scale of the charges and the evidence gathered, the outcome was not really in doubt, but the proceedings laid bare in public exactly how this empire had been constructed and what it had cost the city. Witnesses described the organization's internal structure in detail. Former workers, many of them young men from the South who had been essentially recruited into the operation, testified about how it all worked. Some of them came across less as hardened criminals than as people who had been caught up in something they didn't fully understand, lured by money when they had nothing else. The brothers were convicted. The sentences were severe, reflecting both the scale of the operation and the federal government's aggressive posture toward crack cocaine cases in the late 1980s, which was itself a product of mandatory minimum sentencing laws that critics argued were racially biased in their application. Penalties for crack cocaine, which was disproportionately used and sold in black communities, were dramatically harsher than penalties for powder cocaine, which skewed toward white users. The disparity was 100-to-1 in sentencing guidelines. 100-to-1. That disparity didn't exonerate the Chambers brothers, but it did mean that people operating at every level of their organization, from the brothers themselves down to the teenagers standing on corners, faced sentences that many legal scholars considered extreme, even by the standards of serious criminal enterprise. Some of the Chambers brothers received sentences of life plus additional decades. Others received lengthy terms that essentially amounted to life sentences. The operation that had employed hundreds and generated billions was over. Detroit didn't recover from the crack era quickly. Some would argue it still hasn't fully recovered. The communities on the east side where the Chambers operation had been concentrated spent years, decades, clawing back from the devastation. The addiction, the violence, the broken families, the young men who went to prison, the children who grew up without fathers, the mothers who lost sons to either bullets or incarceration. The damage ran deep and it ran long. The city itself filed for bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The causes were complex and decades in the making, but the collapse of communities that had once been economically viable, accelerated by the crack epidemic and the violence and incarceration that came with it, was part of that story. And yet, Detroit has also shown a remarkable capacity for reinvention. The city has made genuine strides in the years since, with new investment, a revitalized downtown, a growing tech and creative sector. The story isn't over. As for the Chambers brothers themselves, their story has taken on a kind of mythological quality in Detroit's cultural memory. They're referenced in rap lyrics, true crime discussions, and documentaries as a cautionary tale, a case study in what happens when extreme poverty, systemic abandonment, and the crack economy intersect with human ambition. Are they villains? Absolutely. The harm they caused was real and lasting. The addiction they fed, the violence their organization perpetuated, the young lives swallowed up in their operation. None of that gets a pass because of their backstory. But are they also, in some complicated way, a product of an America that had already failed the communities they came from and the communities they destroyed? Yeah, That's true too. That's the uncomfortable tension at the heart of the Chambers brothers story. It's not a story of pure evil genius, and it's not a story of tragic heroes done wrong by the system. It's messier than that, more human than that, more American than that. Four brothers from the Mississippi Delta, shaped by poverty and sharecropping and the desperate hunger to be something, traveled north to a broken city and built an empire out of other people's pain. And then the whole thing collapsed, as it was always going to. Billy, Larry, Willie, and Otis Chambers, the Detroit Kingpins, the Chambers brothers, gone, but not forgotten. If this story hit different, drop a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shaped America's cities. Let me know in the comments. What part of this story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments.